Can everyone see my screen? All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Rare New England's Medical Genetics Career Fair. My name is Nicole White, and I am the Executive Director of Rare New England. Rare New England's mission is to bring together New England patients, families, families, and providers touched by rare and complex disorders. We offer educational opportunities, create awareness of available resources, and build foundations for support to improve patient quality of life and support the professional needs of healthcare providers. First, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Amy Kritzer, who is an attending in the Division of Genetics and Genomics at Boston Children's Hospital. You'll also see here our guest speakers this evening, who Dr. Kritzer will be formally announcing. Lastly, we'd like to thank our supporters for our medical genetics career fairs. We have the New England Regional Genetics Network, Ultragenyx, Vertex, Horizon, and Homology. And I will hand it over to Dr. Kritzer.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our career fair today. I'm Dr. Amy Kritzer. I am a clinical geneticist and a medical biochemical geneticist or metabolism physician. I'm also the clinical director in the Division of Genetics and Genomics at Boston Children's Hospital. And my work mostly focuses on clinical care, quality improvement, and process improvement. In other words, trying to find ways to deliver care and make improvements that impact patient experience, patient safety, and make our system work in a wonderfully efficient manner. Today, we are going to be introducing you to some fabulous colleagues that you will learn about how they have entered the field of genetics and how they have practiced medicine in this field. And really, when we think about genetics, it is an area of medicine that really touches all aspects of a patient's care, and genetics is now expanding so rapidly that it's really, in some ways, you're always learning something new. And there are over 7,000 rare diseases, many of which are genetic. And so there's a lot of information to be shared with patients. There's a lot of novel therapies that are coming down the line or are in clinical practice or clinical trial now. And so genetics is such an exciting field that we're really excited to share with you how we got involved in doing what we're doing and why we think it is a wonderful area of medicine. There will be time for questions and answers, a question and answer session after you hear brief presentations from all of our presenters. We're going to ask them all to introduce themselves and to speak for about 10 minutes or so on their field and their career. And then we'll have an opportunity to circle back with questions that you place in the chat, and we thank people who may have submitted questions ahead of time. And so with that, I'm going to ask Dr. David Weinstein to introduce himself and to share his experiences and his journey through being in genetics.
Okay, let me just see if I can get this. Hello, everybody. Let me just see if I can get this to project. Is that showing correctly? Okay, so well, I only wish I was there to get with you guys and we were all together like it was at one point in the old days, because there's nothing better than seeing the young professionals and to get them excited about this. So my name is David Weinstein. I was in the academic world for 30 years, and I will take you on a journey, my journey, to, I hope, inspire you to do rare disease. I think it is the greatest area. You can make a huge difference. So instead of wasting my time with an introduction about me, let me take you on a journey. So just for disclosure purposes, you can see I was in the academic world. I then went to industry for a few years, and now I'm serving as a consultant for rare disease trials, and those companies are there. And I will just say that this reflects my opinions and not the interest or the feelings of any of the companies. So when I was a young physician trying to figure out what to do with my life, one of my mentors at Boston Children's gave me this book to read, and it was about living a life that matters. And in the book, it talks about trying to determine what's important in life. Is it money? Is it titles? Is it publications when you're in the academic world? And that everybody can make a difference, that you just have to figure out what makes you happy. And I was struggling because I was doing Alzheimer's disease. So I was at Boston, I was at Harvard, and I went there to do Alzheimer's disease. I went there because 3 of the 5 biggest people in the field were in Boston. And I was this young, idealistic doctor, and I was given space at Mass General. I said, oh, this is going to be the greatest experience. I'm going to go where everybody's working on this disease. And I got there and I realized it wasn't as I thought it was going to be. The doctors didn't talk, people didn't work together. Unfortunately, we had success in the labs, but it wasn't making me happy. I didn't see that the work I was doing was impacting the patients, and the patients continued to deteriorate. And I love the research, but it was wearing me down watching day after day after day, the patients with Alzheimer's disease just not benefiting from the work. And so I made a decision, which was what I was told it was one of the several times in my career where I was told I was committing academic heresy, and that I was, academic suicide, because I won the award for the best research in the field of gerontology from a graduate student, which came with a 3-year grant, and I gave it all up, and I was reincarnated as a pediatrician. Probably the only person who was a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Gerontological Society of America at the same time. But I decided that being a pediatrician is where I can make a difference. While I was at Boston Children's, I started to see patients with glycogen storage disease. I'm a pediatric endocrinologist by training, but I fell in love with this population. I fell in love in 1998. I was invited to the National Conference for Children with Glycogen Storage Disease, and I was shocked by what I saw. The conference was devoted to liver transplantation, and people were so positive that it was wonderful that we could do liver transplants and these children could survive for several years. I found it extremely depressing. To do a liver transplant in a child as your only hope was not something that I thought was wonderful. I thought we needed to do better, but there was no clinical research that was occurring in the field. In fact, there had been 16 years without a major advancement for the field of glycogen storage disease. And unless you have research, there's no hope that it's going to get better. So I decided over lunch, after talking to some of the families, that this is where I could make a difference. And to this day, I think that was the second wisest decision I made. The first one was getting married to my wife. But it was a decision that was not supported by my colleagues or my division chief at Boston Children's, but I decided that I had to follow my heart instead of my brain and do glycogen storage disease work. Well, this is not a lecture on glycogen storage disease, but advances have happened in treatment. As you can see here, patients are now healthy, and you would never know that any of these people have glycogen storage disease. In 2001, the first child was born to a mother with GSD in the United States. And I'm happy to say that 88 children, as of last week, have now been born to mothers with the disease that I followed. But the biggest honor for me is that 8 of my former patients have become doctors. 6 of them came to work with me at the different institutions that I was at. And to work with your patients and see people who once had a disease that was considered fatal or one that needed a liver transplant be doctors has been a dream. But my dream was really to do even better. I'm a clinician first. I love taking care of patients, but I also wanted to do better. So I've been working on gene therapy now for over 25 years. We started doing gene therapy in liver cells when I was at Boston Children's. Then we went to mice with Janice Chu at the NIH. And then I moved to the University of Florida to do gene therapy in dogs after the FDA said that we had to treat the dogs that naturally have the disease. I'm a dog lover, just to emphasize, these dogs naturally have it. We did not create them. After treating dogs, we finally got permission to do gene therapy in humans. And then in 2018, I think had the greatest experience you could ever have in the academic world, which was treating my first patient with glycogen storage disease with gene therapy. This is a picture from that treatment, and I'm happy to say that 5 years later, that patient is doing well, and he is completely off cornstarch. It's been remarkable to live through this. But unfortunately, the real world is that the medicine has become a business, and I don't mean to disillusion anybody, but when you do one disease, patients have to travel in to get their care. And we had patients coming from 54 countries, but we did not really have local patients. I was in Connecticut at the time, and during COVID, the administration said, "You're not making any money," and they fired my whole team. And except for me, but without my team, we couldn't do this. And so the program closed during COVID. I went to industry to work on gene therapy for other disorders. I was working on gene therapy for GM1 gangliosidosis, metachromatic leukodystrophy, and Krabbe disease. I have then left, and I'm no longer working for one company, but I'm serving as a consultant to try to bring new technologies to children with rare disease, including gene therapy, mRNA treatment, tRNA, and gene editing. So if anybody has questions about academics or industry or opportunities, there are plenty of opportunities for you. But I wanted to end with a couple lessons that I have learned. You can make a huge difference when you're dealing with rare diseases. There's lots of people who do heart disease or diabetes, but the children with these rare diseases need your help, and you can really help. You can make such a big difference. Patients suffer because of the lack of knowledge and lack of care. So you heard earlier from Amy that there are over 7,000 diseases, and unfortunately, most doctors don't know about them. And so if you care enough to learn about these diseases, you can really help these children who are suffering. Bigger is not always better. As I said, I started in Alzheimer's. It was a big field. In the rare disease community, people work together, which is also wonderful. I would encourage all of you to take some chances. If I followed the safe pathway, I would be doing Alzheimer's disease right now. And I have loved every moment of being a GSD doctor and a rare disease doctor. And if I listened to my mentors, I wouldn't be doing this. And finally, don't lose your idealism. We all go into medicine to help people. And yes, it is a business, but ultimately we're here to treat patients. And don't lose that idealism. Remember why we went into medicine. So thank you very much. It's been an honor. I love doing this. I love coming to the Rare New England events. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weinstein, for sharing just a part of your amazing story and the wonderful experiences you've had. And I'm sure we will come back to you with many questions later. I'd now like to invite Dr. Jody Hoffman to introduce herself and to share some of her perspective.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kritzer and Dr. Weinstein, for getting this all started and inviting me today. So I wanted to talk about genetics from the perspective of a clinician. I am a medical geneticist at Boston Medical Center, and prior to that, I was at Tufts Medical Center. And I think when I was maybe in the 5th grade or so, I started becoming very interested in reading books that were based on real people who had rare diseases. I remember there was a book about a little girl with cystic fibrosis, and maybe some other metabolic conditions. And after that, in middle school, we started to do some, at that time, they were called dittos, which are essentially today's photocopies, where we learned how to line up A's and C's and T's and G's and make a little roadmap with those. And I just thought that the whole language of genetics was just absolutely amazing and miraculous, and felt that it was really the secret to life. And I think everybody who practices medicine feels that their area of medicine is the most important. But I kind of feel like, we have a little leg up here on neurosurgeons or cardiologists, because if the genes don't work well, we don't even start out with a brain or a heart. So I've always really felt that genetics is just at the very basis of life. And it has been an area that I've wanted to work on for a long time. Although there were times in my life when I thought I would do the research tract, and eventually decided that living in the patient world was most satisfying and exciting to me. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I do as a clinical geneticist so you can get a sense of opportunities in the field. One way I like to start is thinking about, why do our patients come to our clinic? So if someone's coming to a clinical genetic setting, they're often coming for multiple different reasons. So their doctors may be referring them because, oops, sorry, go back. Because they have multiple differences in how their bodies are formed. And that can be the outer parts of the body, like the ears or the nose or the fingers. It could be internal congenital anomalies. It could be differences in hearing or vision, people that are born unable to hear, or people that have retinal differences or lens differences that make it challenging for them to utilize those organs. It could be people that are very small or very large, or the head size is much smaller than it should be, where the brain didn't develop fully, as you see in this child. It could be for unusual skin findings. I find this to be a remarkable skin pattern that we can see in some people who are born with two different cell lines that have different chromosomal material in them usually. And you can see there's a dark pattern and a light pattern, and it's just absolutely amazing. But it is something that we can look into in a genetic way and try to understand what is at the crux of that, and is there anything that's associated with that that we should look out for in the child? How can we guide that family to help that child leave the to meet their greatest potential, to stay healthy throughout their lives as much as possible? We have a lot of people referred because they have cognitive challenges or developmental delays or autism spectrum disorders, or very specific behaviors such as eating a tremendous amount or hiding food. And these are all reasons that seem very neurologic, but can have a genetic basis. And we can also, in the neurologic area, think about people that have seizures, but they have seizures plus something else going on, whether that be delay or autism or intellectual disability, or a difference in how their facial features are formed compared to that of their family. And then lastly, we have patients that are referred often by their providers, but also sometimes on their own. They self-refer due to a family history of a genetic condition, a family history of a cancer predisposition syndrome, where they've seen something like Lynch syndrome, where we see generation after generation of early onset colon cancer, uterine cancer, gastric cancer, ovarian cancer. So we see patterns of cancers that can be predicted, and there's screening available to pick these cancers up before they become so serious that they can't be treated. And other people might have family histories of a child that passed at an early age and they're not sure why, but prior to their reproductive years, they want to understand what they are at risk for. So in my practice now, although I did train by first going through a pediatrics residency, followed by our genetics residency, I do now have about a third of my patients that are adults. And in my training, I really thought I solely wanted to practice on with pediatric cases, but I've really found that although I love children and I love families, I also really like the challenge of speaking to an adult about their own medical condition as opposed to an adult about their child's medical condition. So, sometimes we go in with one area of practice and we explore another and realize that we can incorporate that in our lives also. So that's been very rewarding to have trained in pediatrics, but also through genetics, be able to take care of adults and people of all ages. So I just wanted to give an example of a child that we may see in our clinic at Boston Medical Center. So in this case, I had a lovely 8-year-old girl. She did come sitting in a wheelchair, unable to walk on her own. She didn't speak, but she was able to gesticulate at times to express her needs. And she had a chronic history of seizures. She had had testing through multiple geneticists prior to my arriving at Boston Medical Center. And her mother had kind of taken a break for a few years because she was exhausted from all of the blood testing and talking about genetic testing. But she said, you know what? My neurologist said it's time to come back. It's been a while. So she came back and we said, you know, nowadays, instead of looking for one specific condition, one gene at a time, we do much more of a broad look at conditions. So this child had seizure disorder. So we said, we're going to look at a group of about 300 different disorders that are genetically predisposed that cause seizures, as well as some other features. And lo and behold, after 8 years, we did find that she had an abnormality in the ZEB2 gene. And this is a gene for a condition called Mowat-Wilson syndrome, which is known for very specific facial features, seizures, intellectual differences, and did match well with this child to some extent. But the facial features were really not classic from those that were described in the literature. And although this mother was extremely grateful for finally having some information about her child, getting some support group connections, learning about conferences that she could go to with other parents, she said, "Doctor, with all due respect, like, why did it take 8 years to figure this out? You said you heard of Mowat-Wilson syndrome before. You know, why didn't you tell me before sending the test that you thought she had Mowat-Wilson syndrome?" And I said, I have to be honest, I really didn't know that she had Mowat-Wilson syndrome, despite the fact that I've seen other children before. And she said, well, why is that? And I said, I am concerned that that is possibly due to the fact that we've had some limited exposure to people of backgrounds that are not necessarily white, and that the pictures in the literature do not necessarily represent the full spectrum of ancestries that are seen in America, and that we were now seeing these features in an African-American child. So if you look at my current patient, and this family had given permission for education, educational use of this photo, you see this beautiful young lady on the left. And then you see these pictures of a child of a white background who, these are all pictures of the same child and him growing up through the years. But if you look at the facial characteristics in him, which I think seem very overt, they're much more subtle in this young lady. And we don't see the same bulbousness of the nose. We don't necessarily see as severe pushing up of the earlobes. We don't see as triangular a facial shape as we do as maybe the 8-year-old or so child in the bottom left picture with the blue collar on his shirt. And so I do think that it is possible that we have not necessarily identified as many children with rare diseases of different ancestral backgrounds that have been represented in the medical literature in European countries and America to date. And that's something that we're all working on. But as I mentioned before, this family was very grateful. They were connected to a family group. They met other people with this disorder. And they really were able to get some of their answers that they had always wondered about in terms of how this child's life is likely to proceed, what they needed to put in place for her to optimize her life and her living opportunities, and what skills she needed to live more independently as she aged. So this was quite a rewarding moment for me to have been able to share with this family. I also have a young lady who I'm still in close touch with, and she has a disorder called pycnodysostosis. It's what's referred to as a skeletal dysplasia, meaning that the bones are formed in a way that's different than expected. This is a recessive disorder that's passed on by both parents being healthy carriers. And she's a child who I had seen for many years at a clinic in Fall River from her early years of life. She was actually born to parents who were about 15 and 16. This was an unplanned pregnancy, but when they gave birth to this child and saw that she needed the help and dedication that two parents would need to give, they decided to stay together and give it a try. And they became wonderful, wonderful parents to this child. And I got to watch her over my, I guess probably about 16 years, watch her age, grow in height, development, have some setbacks, learn to drive, go to college. And she actually went to University of Pennsylvania. And when my kids were applying to college, she actually gave my kids some advice, which was really great. She then went on to social work school, and she's doing some really great things in New York at this point. And it's just been a real privilege to be involved in her life and help her problem solve over time. She actually, at one point in her teenage years, wanted to learn to drive, and her parents said, "No way, Jose," because her bones are extremely fragile. And they were like, if you're in a car accident, all of your bones are going to break. We don't want you to learn to drive. And that was a big struggle because, she has fragile bones, but she wants to live as typical a life as possible. And she did all the research into how other people with pycnodysostosis have learned to drive. She got extenders to put from her feet to the pedals of the car. She got things that could help rise her off the seat. She researched getting the car that had the best view for her, and she really made it happen. So it's just so inspiring and amazing to see our young patients grow up to adults and, as Dr. Weinstein said, go on and have successful careers and know that you were part of helping keep them healthy and get to the places they wanted to be in life. Other times I've gotten to work closely with metabolic teams, which is not really my area of focus. But in this case, we did have a little boy who presented at Tufts Medical Center. And from across the room, I said to myself, I really think I know what this child has. I think he has a lysosomal storage disorder. At that time, he had certain facial features, kind of excessive hair around the eyebrows and eyelashes with kind of a shorter looking trunk that was very prominent because the liver was very enlarged. And I said to myself, wow, this is going to be a really hard diagnosis. Let's see what we can do and get him across the way to Children's Hospital. And he's been followed there since that time. And he did eventually get a bone marrow transplant and is doing quite well. So again, sometimes we start cases and we transfer to those who have the most expertise in these rare conditions, because none of us can be an expert in everything. And we want to make sure that every child gets their optimum level of care. And lastly, just a little bit more about what I do outside of clinical medicine. I am always pleased to be involved in small research projects and reports. So every now and then we have something that's just so interesting that we need to reach out to our colleagues and say, have you seen this before? Let's get to the bottom of this together. And in the upper right-hand picture, you see a condition called arrhynia, where this child did not develop a nose typically. And we worked in partnership with some folks in the DGAP program over at Children's, and they actually developed a fish model, a zebra fish model, in which they changed the structure of the facial development by changing one of the genes. And so they were able to eventually figure out the parallel between the human model of arrhynia and the fish model and figure out what gene was involved in people. I've also been very involved in learning about new test methods for certain conditions, making sure that we're doing optimal testing. So in the old days, we did Tay-Sachs enzyme testing all the time, and now we do much more genetic-based sequencing. I also work with the Framingham Heart Study and get to speak to their research patients on clinically actionable results. And as with most of my colleagues, we all like to participate in committee work, like with the American College of Medical Genetics. I was on the ethics committee for a long time, and now I work with their programming committee. And we also like to volunteer with patient support groups like the National Tay-Sachs. And kind of the pluses and minuses of being a doctor is that sometimes you end up doing legal work, which maybe you don't feel well situated to be involved in. But on the other hand, sometimes it's very important to be involved in such cases, like in cases of unexplained fractures or bruising in children. We often work with the Department of Children and Families in Massachusetts to make sure that those children are properly identified with having genetic disorders if they have them, and if not, making sure that they have a safe environment to grow and develop in. And then lastly, I think most of us are involved in some sort of teaching, and the teaching that I tend to do most is with the Boston Medical Center genetic counseling program. So as opposed to the MD route, there's also a master's route to be a genetic counselor. And I really enjoy working with that. So overall, I think that It's a fascinating career where you can really stretch your brain in many different ways, whether it be clinical, research, diversity, ethics, committee work, legal work, education. And I've been lucky to get a taste of all of those. So I hope you'll join me in thinking about the career of genetics, and I will stick around for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman, for sharing fabulous stories about your own journey and some wonderfully inspiring stories about your patients as well. And now I'm going to ask Dr. Alexander Holtz to join us and tell us a little bit about his journey through in genetics.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alex. I'm a physician scientist geneticist, and I'm really excited to talk to you all here today. I'm actually kind of jealous. I really want to give a shout out to Rare New England for doing this, because when I was in your seat as a medical student or undergrad, I didn't even know medical genetics existed as a specialty. So I love that this organization is spreading awareness of this really, really wonderful field. And when people ask me why I went into genetics, I say, why doesn't everyone just go into genetics? I think it's the coolest subspecialty in all of medicine. It's one of the most exciting fields. It's one of the fastest changing fields of medicine as the technology becomes cheaper and cheaper and more accessible. So it's funny. So how did I even get into this in the first place? So I did my MD PhD program at Michigan, and actually was going to apply into pathology. So I had my entire application was set up to go into pathology. And about a month before the deadline to apply to residency, the MD PhD program director, Donna Martin, she said, come rotate with me. You'll have a great time in genetics clinic. And I said, what's genetics clinic? Okay, I'll come and check this out. And that kind of really changed the entire course of my career. And one of the cases that I saw during that time really spoke to me. It was a young boy. He was maybe about 2 years old, and he had this bizarre condition where every time he got a fever, he went into fulminant liver failure. It is really, really sad disease and really, really horrible disorder. But one of the clinical genetics fellows at that time had heard about a condition like this at a conference, and there was a gene associated with it called NBAS, and we tested the child, and lo and behold, he actually had this condition. I just thought it was such a rare and wacky kind of disorder that we knew really nothing about. And so as someone who's a physician scientist, to be able to see a patient in the clinic, diagnose them with a new rare disorder was really a cool opportunity, because you could then take the tools and skills that I had learned as a molecular biologist and developmental biologist to then go into the lab and actually do some functional studies and try to learn more about this disease, which is what I think we really owe the patients and families, is to look deeper into these disorders. So after seeing that case and after spending that time in the genetics clinic, I was hooked, and I made a whole new application for ERAS and ended up matching into the combined pediatrics and genetics residency program at Boston Children's Hospital, which I just finished about a year and a half ago now. So my particular focus now is actually on diseases that affect the respiratory system. So based on my PhD work, it was in developmental biology. I had an opportunity to work in the lung as a developmental model organ system, and I just really fell in love with it. I thought it was just a beautiful organ, and there was so much that was unknown about how the lung develops and how that works. And similarly, when I started to do work at Boston Children's Hospitals, I noted that, in terms of genetics, right, there's a lot of known genes that affect the development of the brain, development of the heart, development of the kidneys. But I felt like the pace of discovery in pulmonary medicine was far behind these other fields, which is really sad, because if you think about it, the first gene disease association that was ever discovered was the cystic fibrosis gene by Francis Collins at the University of Michigan at that time. So I felt it was kind of an injustice that the field of pulmonary medicine had fell really far behind. So I really wanted to combine my research interest in pulmonary medicine and lung developmental biology with the genetics of respiratory disease. So with that in mind, I came across another really interesting case. It was really, really sad case. It was a young girl. She was an infant in the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit at Mass General Hospital. She was about 4 months old at that time. And so she was very, very sick. She had congenital anomalies affecting pretty much every organ system. But she had really severe lung disease called interstitial lung disease, for which we had biopsies and showing some kind of interesting things. And she had to breathe through a hole in her neck through a tracheostomy, and she was on a ventilator. I felt that was, and this young girl had the fanciest genetic testing that we can offer at the time, which was exome sequencing, and there was no answers that came from that test. So I got an opportunity to kind of get the data from her exome sequencing, and through that we identified a change in a gene that could be an explanation for some of the things that she was experiencing. And I said that because there were some scientists who had been studying this particular gene called MYH10 for quite some time, and there was a bunch of mouse models out there related to this gene where scientists had knocked the gene out or manipulated the gene in a mouse and saw that they could cause all of these developmental defects, including lung disease, heart defects, brain defects, all the things that this child experienced were found in these animal models. And so I felt that was a really kind of a cool candidate gene to look into. And from then, with encouragement of some of my mentors, we were able to put this gene through a program called Gene Matcher. I like to think of it as like a Tinder for geneticists. You just put up the gene and you put up a very basic phenotype. And what happens is it matches you with other investigators across the world who may have a patient who has a change in the same candidate gene. And then you can talk to each other and see, do the phenotypes fit? Do they match with each other? And lo and behold, we were able to develop a cohort of 16 people around the world who have changes in the same gene who present with very, very similar features. So I felt that was just so cool that you could take an interesting case that you found, on the consultation service from a clinical perspective, and then turn that into this research project where you can actually, define a new genetic disorder. And then I was able to then go into a lab for a year and do some functional biology to again explore the mechanism of this disorder and try to figure out what was going on. And for me, what the coolest thing was then to see that family again in clinic. I remember this very vividly. They had been looking for an answer for a really, really long time as to, what was happening with their daughter. And to be able to tell them, we actually have this answer. There are all these people around the world who have a change in the same gene going through the same thing. That was just such a cool experience. So kind of moving forward, I had kind of my experience in gene discovery, which I think is really important, but I'm really now focused more on treatment because, I think the first step is diagnosis, but the next question I always get in clinic is, okay, well, what are we going to do about it? And for many disorders now, we actually do have things that we can do, but for many disorders, there's, we're very limited in the types of things that we can do. So I really want to, be able to diagnose, but then also say, yes, we have something that we can do here, whether it's gene therapy. My particular field now is actually cellular therapies. So I'm in the lab of Daryl Cotton at Boston Medical Center. And what we do is we use induced pluripotent stem cells, and we can take these cells. So effectively, an induced pluripotent stem cell is I can take any cell from the body. We use blood cells. We can add 4 magical factors to these cells, and we rewind the clock. So we can turn a blood cell into an actual, an embryonic stem cell-like cell. When we have an embryonic stem cell-like cell, we can then turn it into any cell of the body. And if we have the right cell, we can then, use those cells as cellular replacements. And we can use this from the patient's own cells. So my particular focus right now is on pulmonary vascular disease and an entity called pulmonary arterial hypertension, which is a really, really devastating disease for which there are very limited treatment options. And so kind of what my hope is for the future is that we can take cells from a patient with a genetic form of pulmonary vascular disease. We can reprogram that program into stem cells. We use gene editing to fix the mutation in the gene that's causing their disease, and then take those stem cells, differentiate them into the lung blood vessel cells, and then put them back in the patient. So that way they have healthy lung cells to hopefully cure their disease. So that's kind of what my focus is right now. And I think, for those of you who are interested in research, I think clinical genetics is the best field out there to combine a career in both clinical care and research. the advice that I got as a physician scientist was you'll be the happiest as a physician scientist if you can truly combine your clinical work with your research. And there's no divide right now between my clinical work and my research. I see a patient in the clinic, I do give them genetics care, the molecular studies, the counseling that we give them, and then I take a blood sample, I bring it to lab, we turn it into stem cells, and then we do our work. So there's really no better field than clinical genetics for a physician scientist. And I'll leave the rest we need some time for questions. So.
Thank you, Dr. Holtz. What again, phenomenal story of your journey. And as you said, didn't even know genetics was a field, and thank goodness for the people who introduced you to it and have started such an incredible journey for you. I think a question we get asked a lot is, okay, I'm hooked. I want to think about this career in genetics, but I'm an undergrad, and how can I get involved now? And then what are the different training options for someone who goes through medical school and then wants to go into clinical genetics? So for our current undergrads, or for our maybe graduating seniors who think, I want to do some gap year time, and I'm really interested in genetics, what are my options? Dr. Weinstein, do you want to have some thoughts or suggestions for those students?
Sure. I think the best way to, if you're an undergrad, the best thing to do is reach out to any geneticist or any researcher. We all love what we do. I can say one thing about the rare disease field is that people are passionate. You don't go into this for the money. We're not neurosurgeons. You go into because we want to help people. And I think all of us would love to have you come spend time with us, to see patients with us, and most importantly, to get involved. You can get involved with some of the studies, and it's a great way if you're doing a gap year, or even when you're an undergrad. I always had undergrads in my lab, or I had medical students. I think please reach out. We all love the help. We love when people get excited by our field, and I think you'll find that everybody would love to work with you.
I will echo that. I think, we had a student who I had met in a Rare New England career fair, and she reached out and said, I'm really interested. And I didn't have an opportunity at that time, but I kept her information, and she periodically reached out. And when I was able to hire an intern to work on some quality improvement projects, working in the equity and diversity sphere, she was the first person I thought of and contacted her, and sure enough, she's been working with me for over a year. So there are definitely opportunities, and I think it is a very small field. So even if you're not based in Boston, you're in Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, it's a very small field. And so the best thing to do is express your interest, and sometimes there's not an opportunity in that moment, but there's often, we love to connect people, especially people who are passionate about a career in genetics. Dr. Hoffman, do you want to talk about you mentioned this a little bit in terms of you went into pediatrics, but now you're treating different patients. Do you want to talk a little bit about the different training paths to be a clinical geneticist?
Sure. So they've certainly changed over time, but historically, most geneticists trained in pediatrics because at that time, we kind of thought about rare disorders as affecting children in the pediatric period. And then a lot of people weren't well enough to make it to their adult years. But now there are two things. One is that a lot of people who started as pediatric patients with rare diseases stay much healthier and live much longer into their adult years. So there are a lot of people who need to take care of adult patients with rare disorders, as well as the fact that we've now identified, like Dr. Holtz was saying, that there are some conditions that are adult onset, like interstitial lung disease, that we don't identify until adulthood. And so really people are needed in all fields at this point, I would say, besides maybe radiology or pathology as the first residency, but there are people that are trained in pediatrics and internal medicine and family medicine and obstetrics that often start a residency in that field for 2 or 3 years, and then transition to genetics, and there are some formal combined programs that allow you to transition, some that are separate. And the American Board of Medical Genetics, I think, has some nice information on their website about how to get to the field of genetics, and the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics also has a nice video about training and what the training would be like. But certainly the first step would be, completing undergraduate years, possibly doing a little bit of time as maybe a coordinator of a study, or maybe working in research or some sort of clinical setting, and then applying for medical school. And I know my understanding of medical school these days is that there are more requirements than there were when we were there, and you have to have a certain number of hours of experience in different areas, which I'm sure is quite challenging. But then it would be during the medical school years that you make that decision as to what's your primary specialty. And then genetics is also considered a primary specialty, but because not many hospitals or academic centers have a department of genetics, a lot of people have like a basic specialty like peds or adult medicine that they're appointed in, and then there's a subspecialty within that department of genetics.
Wonderful. And I think we heard a little bit about what relationships with patient and families can look like in the field of genetics, but can you speak a little bit about relationships with colleagues, whether you spend more time, if you're clinical, in the hospital, out of the hospital? How do you balance all of that into your career? And how do you feel like you work within the medical care team for a patient with a complex rare disease? Dr. Holtz, you want to take that question?
Yeah. I love it. I love it. I think one of the cool things about being a specialist in rare diseases, even at a hospital like Boston Children's, where people are a little bit more comfortable with rare disease in general, there's still a lot of, you're a highly respected member of the care team for that particular patient, because you bring a lot of knowledge and expertise to the case that, people just aren't quite aware of. But yeah, it is an interesting balance. So like, to give you an idea, I mean, I guess I'm a little bit of a different case just because I'm kind of 90% researcher, but typically, most of genetics is an outpatient specialty. So most of your time would be typically spent on the, in clinic, seeing families, and we have really great continuity with our families in the outpatient clinic. And then, a subset of your time, maybe 4 to 8 weeks a year, depending on the size of the practice and whatnot, you'll be and attending on the inpatient service. And the inpatient service is actually a lot of fun too, because it tends to be just like a more rapid pace of things. You're seeing a lot of our consultations in that respect are infants born with a congenital anomaly, and we're kind of starting that diagnostic workup pretty soon after they're born. And what's really cool now is, we're sending these rapid exome tests for most of these kids, and we're getting actually, full exome sequencing results back within a week. So we're really able to, influence care and influence really the entire care for that particular family and for that particular patient. And actually, yeah, it's a really really kind of special thing to be able to do that for a family, to be able to, a child who's born and all these things are going on. It's so complicated and so scary, and then you can come in and actually have an answer. Really does so much for the family. And also sometimes that information comes with prognostic implications that can be really helpful to guide medical care in terms of what we do moving forward. So it's an interesting balance, the inpatient versus the outpatient. But what I'm very new at this. I've been attending just for a year now, but what I love is I've now seen these patients in the hospital, but then they come to my clinic afterwards, which is so cool to I've had now, patients who I saw as a day 3 of life, and now they're a year old and they're in my clinic. And it's just the coolest thing to have that continuity.
Great. And Dr. Weinstein, I'm going to send this question over to you in terms of, we have a lot of, we talk a lot about medicine and careers in genetics and medicine and being physicians, but obviously there's a lot in the research, bioinformatics, development. And so could you speak to some of the other ways that people who are interested in genetics can pursue careers that might not be in the medical or in the physician field?
Okay, sure. If you don't mind, I'm going to say one comment first.
Yes, please.
Because I think there's no specialty that gets to know the patients better than people in genetics and metabolism. And I think for people who are going into medicine because they are doing it to help people, that is the most rewarding thing. So as you were talking, Dr. Holtz, I was just reflecting about, I was not the best example of work-life balance either, because I love my job so much and I love my patients so much that it never felt like work. So the days would get very long. But now, Dr. Kritzer, to your question, there are so many opportunities. I love being a physician, but I also wanted to do work on new treatments. And so people who train, whether you're a genetic counselor or you get a PhD, there are so many opportunities besides just being a clinician, which I love. Working for companies, there are always going to be jobs for people who have expertise in this area, and people who help recruit or do medical affairs. You can help design the studies or design the preclinical studies. So there's an endless world out there. Right now I'm consulting for 16 companies. And part of it is there's just not enough people to give guidance for rare disease trials. And most companies just don't understand the challenges with rare diseases. So you can really make a difference even for research that way.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think we do spend a lot of time talking about medicine. And I think as you heard Dr. Hoffman mention that she works very much in the genetic counseling program. So really, even within a genetics clinic, it's all too often multidisciplinary. In my field of metabolism, we work very closely with dietitians. We could not do our job without our metabolic dietitians. We have social workers, psychologists, who, their expertise in the rare disease world is so specific, and they've learned how to identify the resources that our families need that are very different than resources that exist for sometimes more common diseases. And so even within a genetics clinic, you're going to find so many different team members that are so essential to running that practice. Biostatisticians, quality improvement people who understand genetics and the rare disease world are kind of few and far between. So it is wonderful when you have people who really have dedicated their lives, their careers to making a difference for this patient population. I think just to share selfishly one of, a story, I think we've heard this from everybody here, but, I think the way that our families let us into their lives, it is very humbling. And how much, as you hear, lifetime of watching those children grow up into adults and have their own families, it is really because there are not as many of us. We are one of the few fields that actually can care for people often through the entire lifespan. My youngest patient is a newborn. My oldest patient is 80. And so being able to, even though I am a trained pediatrician, I get to see people through all of those life changes and becoming parents themselves. It is becoming a more rare thing in medicine that you can actually do that lifetime care in a subspecialty now. And part of that's because, there aren't enough of us. So we really do encourage anyone who is interested in this field, please, think about how you could make a career out of taking care of serving the rare disease patient population. I'll invite anybody else who wants to make any closing thoughts or comments, but I think, as you can see, everyone in genetics, and I think if I were to put 3 additional people or 10 additional people on this panel today, you would hear wonderfully inspiring and similar stories based on a real deep commitment to the rare disease patient population.
I just want to say, if you guys can get my email address through this program, please feel free to reach out anytime. Genetics is the coolest specialty. I encourage all of you to at least try it out. Go to a genetics clinic, do an away rotation if you don't have a genetics clinic near you. Just try it out. I mean, genetics is touching every field of medicine, no matter what you do. So I would just recommend this field. It's wonderful.
So how do you keep up then with all of the new advances? That's what one person wanted to know, with all of the new, what's coming next, how do you as a geneticist keep up to date with all of it?
I love reading the literature. That's what I kind of love that, you know, when I make a diagnosis and this was discovered 2 months ago, it's kind of cool to be able to then read the medical literature and prepare for that particular you know, family that you're going to see. So it affords you an opportunity to really dive into the literature and keep up to date.
Dr. Hoffman, how about you?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, first of all, we do try to attend yearly or semi-yearly conferences with all of our colleagues that are usually for several days, and people present the latest and greatest information, as well as presenting things that are kind of standards that we should all know well and that get updated over time. But I think like late breaking news is really often presented at conferences, and abstracts that are presented as posters that you can wander around for hours on end. And there are also several journals, especially the Genetics in Medicine Journal, which is published by the American College of Medical Genetics. They tend to publish some of the most relevant articles. And then, as Dr. Holtz was saying, you know, anytime you see a patient with a certain condition or they're referred for a certain issue, so maybe you have someone referred for, you know, shortening of the proximal bone of the fourth finger, you may do a literature search to try to find all the causes of that condition. So you're always learning, things are always new. And if you're someone who likes to stretch your brain on a regular basis, it's definitely the field for you. You know, I think we all reflect upon if we had done something else, how that would have stimulated or not stimulated us. And for me, this is extremely stimulating. And I think there are some benefits to seeing patients with a certain condition repetitively to become like extremely expert in it. But I like to continue to stretch my brain to all different rare disorders because I just find that fun and exciting. And it's kind of like a suspenseful novel sometimes, you know, what's going to be around the corner? What can you learn next? What clues can be given? What if you look back at the book a year later, you're going to understand more? So always new and exciting.
And
Wonderful.
if you don't mind, I'll just throw a couple
Please.
comments in. There are different ways to do it. I did one disease, and some people would say that would get boring, and never got boring. I loved every day that I saw patients. And as Dr. Kritzer, you said, my patients ended up being from infants, newborns, presenting with hypoglycemia in the newborn period, to I also had an 82-year-old was the oldest one. So I ironically returned to geriatrics by the time I ended. But what's nice about this is it's so stimulating. You can be stimulated by all the various diseases we see. And I give Dr. Hoffman credit for trying to do all those different diseases. I was not good enough to do that, so I did one. But we have gene therapy, mRNA, gene editing, tRNA. We have other new ones that don't even have names yet. And that's what's exciting. And one thing I will say is the people in this field, I said this earlier, are the nicest people you will ever find. We like to work together, and you can't be good at everything. So you pick up the phone and call people. And I think everybody loves that. And that would be the one piece of advice is, whether you focus on many diseases or whether you focus on technology, everybody should work together to help these kids. And so that's the way I think we deal with that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to end, is this is a field where the number of times when you don't have an answer, you have someone to reach out to. And it is a field where no matter who you reach out to, you know, they're going to try to help you. And I think, as you can see, genetics, the other great thing is it's not a one size fits all specialty. Is there so many ways to be in the genetics field that you get to make unique and your own for what suits your clinical interest, your personality, your time frame, your research versus clinic versus industry versus education. There's just so many ways to be in the field of clinical genetics. So we invite you all, if you are interested, to please reach out. Nicole, if you want to jump back in as well.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Kritzer, for moderating tonight's event. as well as our panelists, Dr. Hoffman, Dr. Weinstein, and Dr. Holtz. We really appreciate your sharing your experiences, your professional experiences in genetics, and contributing to our career fairs. Your passion and desire and enthusiasm for this field is very inspiring, and what we as in the rare disease community really need. So thank you all for that. And thank you all to all of our attendees who are with us tonight. Please be on the lookout for your your dinner voucher for participating tonight, as well as some future educational information opportunities that we'll be sending to your emails. So thank you once again to everyone involved, and we hope you have a great night.